So I'm here in the Conduit Club in London with Todd Stern. Todd, you're a fellow at the Brookings Institute, and before that you were President Obama's Special Envoy on climate change.
Yes, right, exactly.
So as you said, the international parlance, the US's minister for
exactly.
climate change.
I was the essentially the U.S. minister for in the international context in the U.S. I was a special envoy for climate change at the State Department and for President Obama.
And we've both been speaking at the Chatham House Climate Conference the last few days. That's the reason you're here.
Right.
And particularly, you've been talking about a topic you're very well qualified to talk about: the Paris Agreement.
Right.
So the international. In the context of international climate negotiations. So this international agreement reached in Paris in 2015 on how we effectively try and limit global warming and deliver a stable climate, in a nutshell.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So, and you've written a great article or paper for the Brookings Institute, there was one particular thing in that paper. It's a great paper, and it's well worth reading.
Thank you, thanks.
But there was one thing, you talk very much about this being a new type of agreement in international law, and one based around norms rather than totally around laws. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, well, so it's not that the Paris Agreement per se talks about norms and expectations. It's that Paris has a number of different things that were innovative, and then I think made it possible after essentially 20 years of trying and not succeeding. To get an agreement done. And this is the first operational agreement on climate change involving the whole world that's ever happened, right, since the original framework agreement back in 1992. So among the innovations is that Paris is a blend of partly legally binding and partly not. But the thing that is the most kind of the signature element of Paris are the country targets that all countries have to take, which in the parlance are called nationally determined contributions, so people refer to them as NDCs, but those are your emission reduction targets, and those are not legally binding. And there are elements of Paris, like the requirement to submit one of those targets every X number of years and to report and be reviewed on how you're doing with respect to those targets and on your emission inventories. Those things are legally binding, but the targets themselves are not. And there have been plenty of people during the negotiations who were passionately interested in those being legally binding. And there have been not many, but a certain number of critics afterwards saying, well, Paris doesn't mean much because they're not legally binding. And
but hold on a minute. I mean, it's always struck me that, people always misunderstand public international law. I mean, there's no international policeman. There's no international government that can enforce law. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. You pull back the screen of public international law, and it's not quite what it seems.
Well, that's certainly true. There are places where there are more real enforcement mechanisms. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is like that, but climate has never been like that and wasn't going to be like that. You couldn't have gotten agreement among all the parties, which was an absolute requirement for Paris to happen, on the basis of legally binding targets. And truthfully, if you'd gotten them, the targets would have been lower, not higher, because countries would have been spooked about what might happen to them, and a lot of them would have put in lower targets for fear of the consequences of not meeting them. But the other thing that's important, in my mind, is that at the end of the day, Paris is going to work in the sense of the overall effort on climate change working to the extent that norms and expectations, which are already rising, they have been rising over the years, have to rise a lot more and put an impetus on countries to want to feel that they need to do a lot more than they're doing. And partly Paris itself helps drive that. You want to get to a point where countries feel that for their standing and reputation they need to do more, but that's not only driven by Paris. It's got to be driven by Paris, it's also got to be driven nationally and subnationally.
But we've got this Paris Agreement, and a lot of people have felt, job done. But isn't the reality is that that's just, I think as Christiana has said, and I had one of these great conversations with Christiana, in a sense that's just the start of the hard work.
There's no question about that.
It's all about the implementation.
There's no question about that. I mean, look, you can't do this without an international agreement, right? Because this is a quintessentially international problem, and countries aren't gonna feel comfortable acting unless they know that their counterparts and their competitors are also acting. You need an international structure. Paris provides that, but it's the structure. You then have to implement it at the national level. You have to have action in the so-called real economy in the private sector, and it's on national levels, and you have to ultimately, and very importantly, have publics engaged who then can drive.
And do you think the public is? I mean, we've had this major climate science report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, all the world's leading climate scientists, just last week. And I've spoken to Professor Chris Rapley at UCL about that. And we've had this summer of extreme weather, and I discussed this actually in the Arctic with Michael Mann, who explained how warming in the Arctic is contributing to that. Yet, I sit in my train carriage last week reading the coverage, and it felt like everyone else in the train carriage, it hadn't penetrated. They were oblivious to what was happening. So, I mean, how do we engage the public in this critical process?
Well, look, that is a difficult question. The reality is that in practically everything involving climate change, sort of the frame that I think about this in is that we're fundamentally in a race against time. Good things are happening. The public is more engaged. Even more visibly than that, you see tremendous progress happening in the development of clean energy and the movement toward the clean energy transformation. That stuff's happening way faster than anybody predicted any number of years ago.
Michael Mann felt that it had caught this summer of heat waves and storms had caught the public's imagination.
Well, I think a lot more than before, and all of these things, the public's attention, the development of clean energy, they're all happening. Again, clean energy is happening a lot faster than expected. I would say I wouldn't say that quite with respect to public attention, but that's moving also. The problem is that the bad stuff's also moving faster than expected. So the kind of frame in my head is always, this is a race against time.
I also, you heard me say it at the Chatham House conference that, we're in this technology-driven transition. The winner is clear. It's clean energy. It's the clean technology. The problem is at the moment, it's not running fast enough to get across the finish line in time.
That's right.
So how do we turbocharge this process that's already happening?
If there were an easy answer to that, then it would have happened, right? There's not an easy answer to that. I think that there needs to be, what I hope is that there are a whole set of factors that will be interacting with each other. It's what people experience and see in terms of extreme events. It's what people are seeing in terms of the clean energy revolution that's going on. It's what happens as your joint carbon trackers talked about what happens in the markets. How you can start to get to a tipping point where you start to move into the world of stranded assets and lower asset prices. Yep. When there's a fairly small penetration by the new challenger technology as compared to, you don't have to get to 50%, you can get to 10% and start to affect the financial fortunes of the incumbents. There's tons of things that are happening. It's crucially important to have the right political leadership. We don't have that right now at the national level in the United States. We did have it in the administration I was part of. But there's a lot of these factors have to interact with each other, and we have to hit, and you can ask me when that's going to happen, I don't know, but we have to hit some tipping point where, look, you see norm change in other circumstances that has been quite astonishing in recent years on different kinds of issues. But you look at, this probably took place over a longer period of time, but look at smoking. I mean, it used to be, at this point, if you want to smoke, you're out on a sidewalk or you're in some cabined little sad room in an airport, right? You look at same-sex marriage. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama both opposed same-sex marriage in the 2008 primary. That's how recent this was.
Wow.
Right? And look now. So,
well, again, Michael Mann...
You can get to a tipping point, and we're not there yet.
Well, Michael Mann, interestingly enough, in our conversation, he talked about two tipping points, and it's a race, it's the climate tipping point, which doesn't really get covered as much, or this tipping point of public consciousness. And of course, the hope is that it's that tipping point.
But it's not just public consciousness, right? Because the public consciousness, there's consciousness is there. What you need is enough public live concern, so that, and if you want to translate it into political terms, when voters see their member of Congress, if it's the United States, giving the back of their hand to this issue, that's then not okay. That's then something that they're going to pay for. We're not there. We're absolutely not there.
That's one of their priority issues.
But that's, I mean, because look, if you look around the world, you will see, in Paris is evidence of the fact that leaders took this on board in a way that had never happened before. It was a milestone, landmark, and it's hugely important that happened in Paris. How many leaders around the world actually get it at the level, not that something has to happen, not that we have to move directionally the right way, but that we have to move at the speed and scale that's necessary? I think very few, extraordinarily few. And in fact, extraordinarily few people, even of very good will, who are smart, who might work in the policy world, who might work in the national security world, who might work in all sorts of, good organizations. Very few of them get the speed and scale. I mean, if people outside of the climate world, very few.
So what's the role? I mean, you've talked about Carbon Tracker's work, and so we very much focus on the private sector and particularly the financial markets. And I think you attended a lunch in San Francisco during the Global Climate Action Summit, where one of my colleagues, Kingsmill Bond, talked about his Vision 2020 report, the energy transition. Right. So what do you think is the role of the private sector? Again, another, I think, probably mutual friend of ours, James Cameron, I spoke to him, and he has this great phrase, which is enterprise with purpose. It's like, governments, lawyers give us the framework, the policy and regulatory framework, and then let enterprise get on with it, enterprise with purpose. Do you think, that is enough, that business can deliver us, or does it need something more?
I think that business I don't think business delivers us. I think business is going to chase the successful thing to do, and that's, they're going to obviously chase the what's profitable. They're also going to be influenced. I think they are influenced already. You can see this all over the place by their own sense of both risk and opportunity. So you have a great many businesses now that are running in a green direction, because be all sorts of reasons, because they see the risk with respect to their supply chains. They see the risk with respect to their own infrastructure. They see the risk with respect to the products that they're trying to sell. So I think that there's.
But do you think there's a feeling that we're at a, one of the key differences now is we're in a transition with an economic tipping point where the technologies, the clean technologies, are now cost competitive and in many cases cheaper than the old highly emitting technologies.
Sure. I think that's also hugely important, and you're going to get, to talk about a tipping point, we're probably going to get to a tipping point in electric vehicles one of these days. Maybe it's 5 years from now, maybe it's 10. I don't know how many years it is, but it's going to be a tipping point when the cost of the unsubsidized cost of the car is cheaper or as cheap as a regular car. You don't have to pay gas. You don't have to maintain it in anything like the same way. You have a ubiquitous charging infrastructure, and you can charge in 5 minutes. Okay, at that point, why would somebody not buy an electric car?
Yeah.
So we're some years away from that, but it's gonna. These curves don't sort of march like this; they go like that.
Yeah, they're S-curves. I mean,
they're S-curves, exactly. And look at what's happened with the penetration of wind and solar.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're going into the steep bit of the S-curve.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's going to be interesting.
And so all of that is going to happen. You've also got countries going to be pushing each other. I mean, anybody can look and see. China's making bets all over the place on clean energy and on electric vehicles, and China and any number of countries in Europe have already announced. Some of them by 2025, some by 2030, some by 2035. It's the end of internal combustion engines.
I spoke to Dr. Marjun again in one of these conversations, the sort of doyen of green finance in China.
He's a super talented guy.
Yeah. But what he was telling me that they're planning to do in China, it was just incredible. I mean, I think most people do not have any idea what China is planning in this space.
Right.
I mean, it's phenomenal.
Right. Now, from my point of view, I would say that's absolutely super impressive and great, and China needs to also apply that green mentality to their infrastructure building around the world. Their famous Belt and Road Initiative, where way too much of coal infrastructure is getting built. But it's not just China. There is a political economy. There's an incumbency with respect to fossil fuels, and you get bad decisions being made for the wrong reason, whether it's China or India or the United States or Europe, all over the place, because you've got strong vested interests that have real clout with politicians.
Well, on that, I think if I'm right, one of the most important things for you in the Paris negotiations was the sort of the transparency, the monitoring and verification part of that. And again, Carbon Tracker, our power and coal team have just released a very interesting report a few weeks ago on using satellites to monitor coal-fired power. Right. I mean, do you think you'll see more of that sort of approach?
I want to see more of that kind of approach, right? Because I think we've had it in our minds for years when we were negotiating this, that the day is going to come when a lot of the best transparency regime is going to be coming from satellites. At the same time, it is important for countries to have the kind of obligation and the practice of reporting honestly and straightforwardly about what they're doing. So I think that there's a confidence building quality about that that's worth continuing, but it would be extremely valuable if the technology, the satellite capacity for everybody to understand what's going on all over the place develops to a point where that can be a sort of secondary and then maybe even more accurate method. But I think it's good for countries to have to report, but good for the world to be able to get the clearest possible view that can't be fudged or.
So you've served in two administrations. The Clinton administration, the White House, and then the Obama administration.
Yeah.
I mean, and you were telling me that one of the first jobs you had was around communicating in the run-up to Kyoto to the American public through having all the country's weather reporters on the front lawn of the White House.
Well, not countries, but local.
Sorry,
cities, states.
I mean, what do you think has changed, or has much changed?
Well, lots has changed since 1997. I mean, I used to joke that I was the only guy in the White House who could bring together business and labor because they both hated what I was doing. And back in 1997, I still have a very clear memory of a meeting with basically the heads of all the major unions in the U.S. They were not happy with what was going on, and neither was business. And the only businesses that were supportive at that point were guys running around trying to make windmills and solar panels, and there weren't too many of them back then. So, it's moved a great deal. And if you look, one of the things that was so painful, really, in living through that period of is President Trump going to announce that he wants to pull out, or can he be convinced not to, is that you had virtually, not unanimous, but damn close view of the American Fortune 500 to stay in Paris, to support Paris, because the thing is, business people are fact-based, and if they're not fact-based, then they're going to be ex-business people. They can't run around like politicians, and particularly the politician-in-chief in the United States right now, in a non-fact-based world. You can't. So they look and they say, climate change is real, it's happening. Paris seems like, amazingly, an agreement that everybody sort of thinks works and can work and can set the stage for the kind of the structure for us. And if we don't have Paris, we're going to have something else. So, why would we oppose it? So there was hardly any. So as distinguished from 1997, you fast forward to 2015, there was hardly any opposition.
Yet, you talk in your Brookings article about these international norms, and you mention the current incumbent in the White House, and it's not just in the US. We have Brexit here, and we have other forces that seem to be eroding that international order. Does your sort of hope around these international norms still work, or is it threatened by this erosion?
Well, that's a good question, and I guess I don't know the answer to that. I think that Paris is a multilateral. Right, this is the climate change, as I said before. It's got to be global, and so this is a place where multilateral action is really important.
Well, it's the only way you fix it, right?
Yes, and so if the perturbations that we're seeing right now in the international order more broadly, with the variety of countries that seem to be moving in a populist and not very international direction, if that were to get worse and worse, at some point that could be threatening. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet, but yes,
it's a worry.
That's potential.
And to finish, I've asked this question of most people I've spoken to. You're a smart, intelligent person. You've been a partner in a law firm. You could be spending your time.
Why aren't I making more money? Is that the question?
That's what I'm getting to. Yeah. Why this? What is there? Is there something particularly that drives you?
Well, so the interesting thing is this for me was not climate change. this was government, right? And not in the sense that I never wanted to be a career person in government, but I always loved politics, and I was always interested. I would go back to. Probably my first political hero was Bobby Kennedy, so I always had the political bug, but I didn't really act on it for a long time. I wasn't one of these guys in college who was like in the college, Young Democrats or something. I was interested at that point. I was sort of more interested in the way societies and cultures worked, but I wasn't looking to be political at that point. But as time went on, I got to feel that way, and eventually, I kind of got my way into first in the 1988 presidential campaign, which did not work for Democrats, and then in the Clinton White House. So I really wanted to work in government, and I wanted to work for, I practiced law coming out of law school. It was fine. It just didn't. I just wasn't passionate about it. You represent. You handle whatever problem comes in the door. I wanted to be more kind of have more of a purpose, have more of a focus.
And spent a long time in law firms.
Yeah, and so I got into that '88 campaign. That didn't work, but I met a bunch of people. I found my way down to Washington. I started working in the Senate for Senator Leahy. He's a wonderful senator, still there. the Judiciary Committee, and I liked working on most any issue that came through the door if the focus was from a public policy standpoint. And when my first job at the White House for Clinton was first as Deputy Staff Secretary when John Podesta was the Staff Secretary, and then when John left after a couple of years, I moved up. That's the original generalist job. You got your hands a little bit into everything. Right. You're a mile wide and an inch deep, but I just was interested in all of it. And I was interested in the Middle East. I was interested in, national security. I was interested in all sorts of stuff. And then I got drafted into climate, and I was always interested in the environment, but I was never a professional environmentalist, which, by the way, I always thought as I came to do these negotiations was an asset. Yeah. I was not, I have huge respect for and work a ton now and did in the government with people who are, in the NGO world, but I thought it was actually useful for me not to come from that place. And then, climate change came along, and then all of a sudden I was like, instead of super wide and not deep, then I was not that wide and got very deep. But I think I could have been interested in a lot of things. But it's also true. I remembered when once I got into this, that probably 20 years before, I think in the 70s, literally, I remember reading back in the old days, New Yorker, which still is my favorite magazine in the world, but still writes long articles, but used to write gargantuanly long articles, right? Yeah. And sometimes they would be 3-part articles. And there was a guy named Barry Commoner who wrote this very long multi-part piece on solar energy, how solar energy could be the energy for the world in the 70s. And I read every word of that thing. I was so interested in it. And then 20 years later, I found myself kind of, in some sense, working in that world. So I wasn't an environmentalist. I got into this by accident. But on the other hand, I always had a kind of innate interest in it, and I was definitely interested in things that would allow me to work on issues from a public policy
And so
standpoint.
just to finish then, what would be your one, to the people watching this, what would be your one call to action?
I guess I would say, look, we have one home. There's not another one for us. The notion that we can muddle through, and that one way or another we're moving in the right direction, we'll muddle through, is not necessarily true. If anybody wants to not be depressed, I would hope, but inspired toward the need for action and not to kind of think mañana. Take a look at a book called Collapse by Jared Diamond, which walks through any number of civilizations historically, going a long time back, that disappeared because people either didn't see or saw, and from points of view, for reasons of governance, religion, whatever, weren't able to mobilize in the right direction, and they disappeared because of environmental catastrophes, and so it's up to us.
But there is hope. As Christiana says, the ultimate climate optimist, there is hope that we can. Yes. First of all, there is hope. Second of all, it's always. There was a super useful report, I think, an important report, just a week or two ago from the IPCC on so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN body. And it's super useful in showing kind of what we're up against. The thing that is important to not be the outcome of that is for people to meet that with despair and think it's too late. The answer is it actually is too late to avoid some things. We are already in it, and it's not. We can't snap our fingers and tomorrow there'd be no emissions. It's going to take some time, but even if we don't hit the goals we most want to hit, the closer we get to them, the better it's going to be, and every extra tenth of a degree that keeps kicking up, the worse it gets. So you're damn right, we've got to keep fighting, and there's always hope, but people and the younger generation even more. This is your world.
Well, yeah, and it's very much the conversation I have with Christiana around the hope is, it's like a force of nature. But I think in many ways you are as well. You're another one of my climate heroes,
Well,
climate rock stars.
Thank you.
So Todd, thank you. And it's great to be in this club, the Conduit Club,
Yeah.
which is, built, around the principles of sustainability. So it's just.
I will
one of those
back
things.
at you too, because I think Carbon Tracker is one of the best joints going, and
thank you.
I am really impressed by the Vision 2020 report. Is terrific, and I look forward to working with you guys more.
Oh, great. Well, it's a great. Carbon Tracker is very much a team effort.
Yeah.
It's a great team of people. So, well, look, thank you, Todd, and please subscribe to the channel and comments, as I always say at the end of these things. Love comments. And getting a conversation going, because we're all one community. So thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.